My wife headed off on a getaway, with her friends leaving just me and our son at home, a boy who'd been paralyzed for 10 years. Her car had barely cleared the driveway when I caught a sound that made no sense at all. There he was, upright at the top of the stairs. My coffee hit the floor. I scrambled for my phone, but he clamped a hand around my wrist fingers, pressing with a force that should have been impossible. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we get into this story, I'd love to hear from you. Drop one word in the comments that describes how you're feeling right now, just one word. It can be anything. Sometimes a single word says more than a paragraph ever could. Now, a quick note. Some elements of this story have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to specific real persons or events is entirely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. I'm a man who deals in facts. I put no stock in miracles. But on a quiet Friday morning, everything I believed about my life, my marriage, and the world I'd built was shredded beyond recognition. It was exactly 5 minutes past 8:00. My wife, Nadine, had just walked out the front door for a weekend wine tasting trip in the Finger Lakes. She'd pressed a kiss to my cheek, told me not to fuss over our son, Colton, and pulled away in her gleaming silver SUV. I stood alone in our wide kitchen in the Philadelphia suburbs, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator. For a solid decade, this household had run on a rigid, unbroken schedule. 10 years ago, a devastating car crash left Colton paralyzed from the waist down. He was 18 at the time, right on the cusp of heading off to college. From that day forward, he'd been confined to a wheelchair, his entire world reduced to the ground floor of our home. Nadine had assumed full control of his care. She wore the role like a crown, the selfless mother, the devoted martyr who gave up everything. I was the engine underneath it all, the man who ground himself down to nothing, paying the relentless medical bills, the specialists, the private treatments. I was pouring myself a second cup of black coffee, savoring the rare stillness of a house that usually felt more like a medical facility. Then I heard it, a thud, heavy, unsteady footsteps from somewhere above me on the second floor. My engineer's brain immediately reached for a rational explanation. Wood contracting and expanding in the morning warmth. A loose shutter catching the breeze. But the cadence was too purposeful, too deliberate, too unmistakably human. And it was tracking toward the top of the main oak staircase. My hand began to shake. I moved out of the kitchen and peered up into the dim shadows of the second-floor hallway. A figure emerged into the pale morning light, falling through the high windows. It was Colton. He was standing. My 28-year-old son, who had not taken a single step in 10 years, was gripping the wooden banister. He was soaked through with sweat, his chest heaving with every labored breath. His legs trembled violently beneath the enormous effort of holding up his own weight. His knuckles had gone white against the wood, but he was upright. He was lowering one foot to the next step, then the other. The ceramic mug dropped from my fingers. It cracked against the hardwood floor and burst apart, scattering shards and sending hot coffee splashing across my shoes, and the expensive ivory carpet Nadine loved so much. I didn't register the heat. I couldn't locate my own legs. I forgot how to breathe. Every law of physics, every grim diagnosis we had, wept over every certainty I'd carried for a decade, all of it dissolved in the space of 3 seconds. Colton, I whispered, my voice collapsing around a sob. Colton. I rushed toward the base of the stairs, tears already stealing my vision. My son, my boy was walking. A miracle. The flat-out impossible unfolding in plain sight right in front of me. I hit the bottom step with both hands outstretched, terrified he was going to pitch forward and crack his skull on the hardwood. "I've got you, son!" I cried out, seizing his waist to hold him steady. "Oh my God, Colton. How is this even possible? I need to call an ambulance. I need to call your mother. She's not going to believe this." I was digging frantically in my pocket for my cell phone, my hands trembling so badly I could barely get the screen unlocked. I had to reach Nadine. I had to tell her to turn that car around and get home this instant. Before my thumb could find the dial, a hand locked around my wrist. It was Colton. His grip wasn't feeble. It was desperate, iron tight, pressing into my bones like a vice. I looked up into my son's eyes, expecting joy or exhausted triumph, or maybe just relief. What I found instead was raw, undisguised terror. "Dad, stop!" he rasped, his voice dropping to a hoarse, urgent whisper. "Don't call anyone. Colton, you're standing..." I sobbed, still overwhelmed by everything crashing through me. You're walking. The doctor said you would never walk again. Dad, you need to hear me right now. He cut in his tone, plunging into something frantic that turned my blood to ice. You have to listen to me. She didn't go to the Finger Lakes. I went completely still. The phone shifted in my damp palm. What are you talking about? Mom didn't go to the Finger Lakes, Colton said, leaning his full weight into me, his entire frame shuddering with the brutal physical effort. It's not a girl's trip. She's in the city. Dad, we need to get out of this house right now. We have to go before she figures out what I've done. I stood there, my 70-year-old mind straining against the flood of impossible information. My son was walking. My son was afraid of his own mother. Not one piece of this made any sense. Colton, you're not making sense, I begged, trying to steer him toward the living room sofa. Let's sit down. You're in shock. The exertion is getting to your head. I am not in shock, he hissed, planting his feet, refusing to move. His eyes kept slicing toward the front door, wild and hunted like an animal, straining to hear what was closing in. She's setting you up, Dad. I heard her on the phone last night. She thought I was asleep. She's with her lawyers today. She's freezing your bank accounts as we speak. And Monday morning, she's filing papers to have you declared mentally incompetent. She's going to have you committed to a locked psychiatric ward, and she's taking absolutely everything. The silence that followed swallowed the room whole. The ticking of the antique mantel clock in the hallway rang like a hammer on steel. A psychiatric ward. I turned the words over in my mouth. They tasted wrong, alien and bitter. Nadine, your mother. Why would she do this? Why are you walking? What in God's name is happening to us? Dad, we are out of time. Colton pleaded, pulling at my shirt with a grip that surprised me. You have to believe me. She is going to lock you away and never let you out, and if she does, I will never get out of this house alive. Please get the keys to the truck. Every part of me wanted to tell him he was delirious. I wanted to insist that Nadine, the woman I'd loved and supported, the woman who had supposedly surrendered her own life to care for our son, was not capable of something so monstrous. I wanted a rational explanation. I wanted the data, the proof, hard measurable facts. Then my phone buzzed in my hand, a single sharp vibration. I dropped my eyes slowly to the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was an automated alert from my primary bank. The account that held the core of my life savings money I'd kept accessible to cover Colton's extensive physical therapy after I sold my engineering firm. I read the message once, then I read it a second time. Urgent security alert. Your primary checking account access has been revoked due to suspicious activity. Please contact your branch administrator immediately. A cold, leaden dread settled into the pit of my stomach, the kind that tells you the solid ground you've been standing on was never solid at all. The kind that confirms your darkest nightmare isn't something you can wake up from. I looked down at the shattered mug on the floor. The dark liquid was spreading through the grain of the wood, ruining the pristine surface Nadine was always so obsessive about keeping flawless. It felt like a portrait of my entire life. I looked back up at Colton, my paralyzed son, standing on his own 2 feet, begging me to rescue us both from my own wife. My wife. The woman who was supposed to be sipping wine upstate but was instead methodically dismantling everything I had built from the middle of downtown Philadelphia. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. My hands had gone completely steady. The confusion and disbelief and shock burned away all at once, replaced by the cold, focused clarity of an engineer who has spotted the structural failure and knows there is only one way out. "Grab my shoulder, son," I said, my voice level and stripped bare of anything resembling emotion. "We're going to the garage. We're leaving right now." I locked my right arm firmly around Colton's trembling waist. He was heavier than I expected, his pale legs shaking hard under the terrifying strain of suddenly being asked to carry him again. We made our way quickly, lurching and unsteady through the long, quiet hallway of what had once been our home. The house felt transformed around me. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a carefully constructed trap built to hold us both. Every imported piece of expensive furniture had been bought with the grand grotesque lie of my only son's shattered spine. We finally reached the heavy oak door. Colton was breathing in harsh, ragged bursts by the time we got there, his face chalk white and slick with cold sweat. I punched the security code into the electronic keypad with a trembling index finger. The heavy steel deadbolt snapped open with a sharp, clean click. We moved together carefully into the cool dimness of the garage. The custom handicap-accessible van occupied the center of the smooth concrete floor. I had paid exactly $85,000 for that specific vehicle, fully outfitting it with a motorized ramp system, hydraulic lifts, and hand controls. It was a towering steel monument to the cruel decade-long lie Nadine had constructed around us both. I yanked the passenger door open and practically hauled my spent son inside. Colton dropped heavily into the leather seat, his chest still working hard against exhaustion. I circled around to the driver's side, pulled myself up behind the wheel, and pressed the engine start button. The engine turned over with a grinding whine, loud, labored, and completely unwilling to catch. I pressed the button a second time. Nothing happened. A dry, hollow sputter rolled through the quiet garage like a bad omen. My engineering brain sorted the sound immediately. That wasn't a dead battery. That was total ignition failure. I jumped out, threw the hood open, and snatched a heavy LED inspection light from my cluttered workbench, directing the beam straight at the engine block. My breath seized in my throat. The spark plugs were gone. Every one of them. The connector wires hung loose and useless against the cold metal. This was no mechanical fault, no coincidence. This was deliberate, premeditated sabotage. Nadine had quietly disabled the van before she walked out the door that morning. She knew full well that Colton couldn't operate my regular vehicle, and she'd made certain I had no way to move him if I panicked and tried to run. She had sealed us in. A wave of cold, pure fury rolled through me, swift and total. I brought the hood down hard. The bang rang off the garage walls like a gunshot. I swung around and fixed my eyes on the far corner, where my old Ford pickup sat, buried under a heavy canvas tarp untouched for years, because Nadine had always despised the sight of it. I hadn't put a single mile on it since the day of Colton's accident. I crossed the garage fast and ripped the tarp away, unleashing a thick cloud of dust into the stale air. The doors were locked. The keys were sealed inside the house in a heavy metal lockbox whose combination I couldn't recall, and I had no time to tear the place apart looking for it. I grabbed a steel wrench from the pegboard, wound my heavy winter jacket around my right fist, and drove it through the driver's side window. Glass exploded across the concrete. I reached in, freed the lock from inside, and swept the broken shards off the seat. I waved Colton over. He hauled himself across the garage floor, on raw determination alone, fighting for every inch, and dragged himself up into the cab. I settled into the cold driver's seat. No key meant hot wiring it. My hands moved on pure muscle memory, 40 years of mechanical work living in the bones of my fingers. I stripped away the lower steering column cover, located the wiring harness. I pulled the red battery wire and the yellow starter wire free from beneath the broken plastic housing, bit the insulation off both ends, and twisted the bare copper together. The dashboard lights blinked and held. I found the ignition wire and struck it against the base. Sparks jumped in the dark cab. The old engine coughed hard, sputtered, then caught with a deep rolling roar. I threw it into reverse and slapped the garage door opener on the sun visor. The door started climbing agonizingly, inch by grinding inch. Far too slow. I pressed the gas and the truck surged backward. The roof edge shrieked against the bottom of the rising door as we cleared it. We hit the driveway with a squeal of rubber. I hammered the shifter into drive, and as I brought the wheel around my headlights, swept the quiet residential street. A large black SUV was moving slowly around our cul-de-sac. No plates, windows blacked out completely. That wasn't a neighbor heading to work. That was a hired surveillance vehicle. Nadine had posted a watcher outside our own home. I killed the headlights and punched the accelerator, driving us hard in the opposite direction. We tore through the manicured streets of the suburb, and I navigated the familiar curves from memory alone. We rode in silence for 2 hours, the old truck rattling toward the rougher edges of Philadelphia. I found a rundown roadside inn and paid for a room in cash. I got Colton inside. I threw the deadbolt. "Colton," I said, into the heavy quiet. "How long have you been able to walk?" He lowered himself onto the edge of the sagging mattress. The flickering sign from the parking lot threw long, warped shadows across his pale face. He stared down at his hands for a long moment, drew a slow, shuddering breath, and finally looked up at me. "5 years, Dad." He said it barely above a whisper, the words almost swallowed by the rattle of the broken air conditioner. 5 years. The number landed in my chest like something physical. 5 years. Half a decade. My mind sprinted back to where this nightmare had begun, all 10 years of it. I shut my eyes for just a moment, and I was back there in the thick, humid heat of an August night a decade ago. The night before, Colton was supposed to leave for his freshman year at Duke University. The house had been full of packed boxes and a kind of pride that fills a room. Then the phone rang, the screech of tires, a shattered windshield, a car crash that supposedly severed his spinal cord at the root. I remembered wearing grooves in the cold linoleum of the hospital corridor, the antiseptic smell, the suffocating weight of it. Then Nadine appeared from the consultation room with the attending surgeon. Her face was a flawless mask of controlled grief. She walked into my arms, weeping softly, and delivered the words that cracked everything I was into pieces. "The damage is permanent, Gerald. His spine is irreparably damaged. He will never walk again." From that moment, the shape of our lives changed completely. Nadine stepped into the role of devoted martyr without hesitation. She absorbed every detail of his care, insisted that standard rehabilitation facilities weren't adequate for our son, and eventually brought in a private specialist. She'd researched obsessively Dr. Reeve Calloway. He offered cutting-edge individualized treatments that conventional medicine supposedly couldn't match. I believed every word of it. I trusted her without question, because she was my wife and she performed the role of the sacrificing, tireless mother with absolute mastery. She stepped back from her social circles. She was home every day. She hovered at the edges of his wheelchair like a sentinel. And I did what fathers do. I provided. I worked until there was nothing left to give. When Dr. Calloway's monthly invoices started hollowing out our savings, I didn't flinch. I sold my majority stake in the commercial engineering firm I'd spent 30 years building from nothing. I drew down my retirement accounts. I sold off the secondary properties. Every piece of professional legacy I had accumulated, I traded willingly because I believed I was buying my son the finest medical care available anywhere in the country. Colton shifted on the worn bedspread, pulling me back into the dim light of that motel room. His breathing was still shallow, his muscles still firing in small, involuntary tremors from the effort of the escape. 5 years ago, I started feeling a burning sensation in my left foot. He said, his voice unsteady with years of compressed anger and a sorrow too deep to name. At first, it was just a faint tingle, like pins and needles. I was so excited, Dad. I thought it was a genuine miracle. I told Mom right away. I told Dr. Calloway the very next morning when he showed up for my physical evaluation. I stared at my son, my analytical mind straining to connect the jagged, horrifying pieces of this puzzle. If you got feeling back 5 years ago, why did you stay in that chair? Why did you never say a word to me? Colton let out a hollow, bitter laugh, with no trace of real humor in it. I did try to tell you. Do you remember when I kept saying my legs were burning, and you assumed it was phantom nerve pain? Mom cut off every one of those conversations before they could go anywhere. But beyond that, it was always the medication. Every single time I made any genuine physical progress, every time I managed to wiggle a toe or flex a calf muscle, Dr. Calloway would call a special emergency consultation. He would shut the bedroom door, stand out in the hallway, murmuring with Mom, and then the two of them would walk back in together with a completely new treatment plan. My stomach turned over hard. A new treatment plan? Yes. Colton said, his eyes filling with tears of long strangled fury. Mom called them my special vitamins. She told me Dr. Calloway had mixed a custom compound, specifically to prevent painful muscle necrosis. She insisted I couldn't survive without them. Every single night, she brought me a small paper cup with 2 heavy capsules inside. She would stand directly over me and watch until I swallowed them. And within 20 minutes, the nightmare would begin all over again. He dragged both hands down his face, as though trying to physically erase what he was remembering. The medicine wasn't helping me, Dad. It was working against me. Every time I took those vitamins, a thick, suffocating fog rolled over my brain. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't hold 2 coherent thoughts in sequence. I felt as though I was submerged, completely severed from reality, just drifting. But the worst part was what it did to my body. Every bit of strength I had managed to rebuild in my legs would disappear instantly. My muscles would go entirely to jelly. I would wake up the next morning completely paralyzed all over again, trapped in a heavy, useless body that couldn't do a single thing on its own, utterly dependent on her for absolutely everything. I sat without speaking, horror holding me perfectly still. The memories came at me in a flood. Coming home from a brutal 14-hour workday, stepping into his bedroom and finding him flat on his back, eyes vacant on the ceiling, saliva collecting at the corner of his mouth. Nadine would dab his face clean with a warm cloth, lifting her tear-glossed eyes to mine and whispering about how badly his condition was progressing. She told me it was the natural course of his neurological damage. She told me I needed to work harder, bring in more money so Dr. Calloway could find a better answer. She lied to me every single day of it. She looked directly into my eyes and used every ounce of my love for our son as fuel for a monstrous, deliberate deception. They kept adjusting the dosage. Colton went on, his voice growing steadier and sharper, driven by a righteous anger he'd clearly carried for years. Anytime my head started to clear, anytime I began pressing for answers or asking for a second opinion from a different doctor, the dose would quietly go up. I was a prisoner, Dad. My own mother was my warden, and Dr. Calloway was her willing executioner. They were systematically dismantling my central nervous system to keep me locked in that wheelchair. The full scale of it was nearly impossible to take in. She had bled my life savings dry to pay a corrupt physician to poison our son. Why? I whispered. The word came out sounding ancient and fragile in that still room. Why would she do this to you? Colton didn't answer right away. He reached down slowly and rolled up his sleeve, turning his pale forearm toward the dim light. Running beneath the fabric, perfectly hidden until this moment, were dozens of dark puncture marks. They weren't treating me. They were sedating me. Colton lowered himself heavily onto the edge of the sagging mattress. The flickering sign outside the window threw long, crooked shadows across the pale skin of his face. He looked down at his trembling hands for a long moment, pulled in a slow, shuddering breath, and then raised his eyes to mine. 5 years, Dad. The words came out barely above a whisper, nearly lost beneath the grinding rattle of the broken air conditioner. 5 years. The number struck my chest like something physical. 5 years. Half a decade. My mind shot back immediately to the very start of this 10-year nightmare. I pressed my eyes shut for just a fraction of a second, and I was back there the thick, humid August night a decade ago. The night before, Colton was supposed to leave for his freshman year at Duke University. Our house had been full of packed boxes and a deep swelling pride. Then the phone call came, the screech of tires, a shattered windshield, the devastating crash that supposedly severed his spinal cord for good. I remembered wearing a path into the cold linoleum of the hospital corridor, the sharp smell of antiseptic, the crushing, suffocating weight of panic with nowhere to go. Then Nadine stepped out of the consultation room alongside the lead surgeon. Her face was a composed, flawless mask of sorrow. She walked straight into my arms and wept softly against my chest, and she whispered the words that split my heart open and left it in pieces. The damage is permanent, Gerald. His spine is irreparably damaged. He will never walk again. From that moment forward, every corner of our life shifted completely. Nadine stepped immediately into the role of the ultimate self-sacrificing martyr. She absorbed every detail of his care and insisted with an air of total devotion that a standard rehabilitation facility simply wasn't worthy of their son. She researched relentlessly and eventually brought in an exclusive, extraordinarily expensive private specialist, Dr. Reeve Calloway. He offered personalized, cutting-edge treatments that mainstream medicine supposedly wasn't capable of delivering. I believed every word she told me. I trusted her without reservation because she was my wife, and she inhabited the role of the endlessly devoted, sacrificing mother with absolute seamless perfection. She gave up her social circles. She was home every single day without exception. She hovered at the edge of his wheelchair like a sentinel, and I did precisely what a father is supposed to do. I provided. I worked myself to the marrow. When Dr. Calloway's exorbitant monthly invoices began draining our savings, I didn't pause for a single moment. I sold my majority shares in the commercial engineering firm I had spent 30 years building from nothing. I emptied my retirement accounts. I sold off the secondary properties. I surrendered every last piece of the professional legacy I had spent my life constructing, and I did it gladly, because I believed I was paying for the finest medical care our son could possibly receive anywhere in the country. Colton shifted on the worn bedspread and pulled me back sharply to the dim reality of that motel room. His breathing was still labored, his muscles still firing in small, involuntary tremors from the sheer strain of our escape. 5 years ago, I started feeling a burning sensation in my left foot. He continued, his voice unsteady with a grief and fury he had held compressed for far too long. At first, it was just a faint tingle, like pins and needles. I was so excited, Dad. I genuinely thought it was a miracle. I told Mom right away. I told Dr. Calloway the very next morning when he came for my evaluation. I stared at my son, my analytical mind still struggling desperately to assemble the full, terrible picture. If you regained feeling 5 years ago, why did you stay in that chair? Why did you never tell me? Colton gave that same hollow, humorless laugh. I did try to tell you. Remember when I kept saying my legs were on fire and you put it down to phantom nerve pain? Mom intercepted every single one of those conversations before they could reach you. And beyond all of that, it was always the medication. Every time I showed any real progress, every time I could feel my foot or twitch a muscle, Dr. Calloway would call an emergency consultation. He would close the door, whisper with Mom in the hallway, and they would come back in together with a new treatment plan. My stomach lurched. A new treatment plan. Yes, Colton said, fresh tears breaking through. Mom called them my special vitamins. Said Dr. Calloway had engineered a specific formula to stop painful muscle necrosis. Said I needed them to live. Every night without fail, a small paper cup, 2 capsules, and she stood right over me watching until they were gone. Within 20 minutes, the nightmare would begin. He pressed the heels of his hands hard against his eyes. That medicine was not treatment, Dad. It was a weapon. Every time I took it, my mind went dark and thick, like a heavy curtain had dropped over it. I couldn't think. I couldn't form a sentence. I felt completely submerged, disconnected from everything, and my body, whatever strength I'd managed to recover, just vanished overnight. Back to Jelly, back to that chair, back to needing her for every single thing. I sat in complete and utter silence, the memories rushing back through me without mercy. Coming home worn through after 14-hour days. Walking into his room. Finding him slack and vacant, staring at the ceiling with empty eyes, saliva at the corner of his mouth. Nadine lifting her face to mine, soft cloth in hand, tears shining, murmuring about progression and deterioration and the terrible cruelty of his condition. Nadine would dab his face clean with a warm cloth, lifting her tear-filled eyes to mine, murmuring about how severely his condition was deteriorating. She told me it was the inevitable progression of his neurological damage. She told me I needed to push harder, earn more, so Dr. Calloway could find a real answer. She lied directly to my face every single day. She looked me in the eyes and used my love for our son as raw fuel for a monstrous, carefully engineered deception. They kept adjusting the dosage. Colton went on, his voice, building in strength, powered by a righteous, barely contained fury. Anytime my mind began to clear, anytime I started pressing for answers or demanding a second opinion from a different doctor, the dose would quietly go up. I was a prisoner, Dad. My own mother was my warden, and Dr. Calloway was her loyal executioner. They were deliberately tearing apart my central nervous system to keep me locked in that wheelchair. The full scale of the betrayal was nearly beyond my capacity to absorb. She had drained my life savings to pay a corrupt doctor to systematically poison our own son. Why? I whispered the word, coming out sounding ancient and hollow in that silent room. Why would she do this to you? Colton didn't answer right away. He reached down slowly and rolled up his sleeve, turning his pale forearm toward the dim light. Beneath the fabric, perfectly concealed until this moment, were dozens of dark puncture marks. They were not treating me. They were sedating me. I looked at those bruise-clustered marks on my son's arm. They were a brutal map, a decade of methodical, deliberate abuse drawn into his skin. My stomach clenched with a sickening blend of deep guilt and white-hot rage. For 10 long years, I had dutifully paid the staggering medical invoices, completely trusting the woman I married to watch over the boy we had brought into the world. I had abandoned my role as his protector because she convinced me my only function was as a financial engine. I reached out with an unsteady hand and drew Colton's sleeve carefully back down over the evidence. The emotional shock was enormous enough to stop rational thought entirely, but I refused to let it win. I am a structural engineer by trade. My entire professional life has been built around understanding how sustained pressure acts on complex foundations, detecting hidden stress fractures long before a structure gives way. My own family was collapsing right now, and the foundation beneath it had been constructed from nothing but deliberate, malicious lies. I dragged both hands down my face and pulled in a long, steadying breath. I had to move from grieving father to cold, precise analyst. I rose from the sagging bed and crossed to the scratch veneer desk, sitting in the far corner of the room. I unzipped my worn leather satchel and lifted out my heavy silver laptop. I opened it, and the bright screen cut through the darkness, throwing pale light across the dusty walls of our temporary hideout. Colton watched me in silence from the edge of the bed, his breathing finally beginning to level out after the brutal physical effort of our escape. Nadine had believed she'd cornered me completely by locking me out of our primary checking and savings accounts. She assumed that cutting off my cash flow would leave me frightened, disoriented, and docile enough to bend to her demands. She had badly miscalculated the depth of my financial planning. During the peak years of my engineering firm, I had quietly established several secondary tax shelter accounts and a private corporate trust that she had absolutely no knowledge of. Those accounts were secured behind layered independent authentication protocols and routed entirely through a separate financial institution. My stiff fingers moved surely across the keyboard, entering the long passphrases and security keys I had committed to memory years earlier. Within 3 minutes, I had broken through her digital blockade. I now had full access to the master ledger of our shared credit lines and the complete historical banking record. I pulled up the live transaction history for the premium platinum card Nadine kept tucked inside her designer purse at all times. She had told me she was driving up to the Finger Lakes for a relaxing weekend of wine tasting with close friends. I expected to see routine highway fuel charges or hotel deposits somewhere upstate. What the screen showed me instead was something else entirely. A picture that was deeply unmistakably wrong. Her card had not registered a single charge anywhere near a vineyard. Exactly 30 minutes after she had kissed my cheek and pulled out of our driveway, a large pending authorization had been approved at a 5-star luxury hotel right in the heart of downtown Philadelphia. She had never left the city. I scrolled further down the screen, my jaw tightening with every line item. Below the hotel deposit came a rapid sequence of large purchases at high-end boutiques along Walnut Street. She had casually spent $14,000 at a luxury jeweler and another $9,000 at an exclusive designer clothing retailer, all within a brief span of just 4 hours. This was not a girls' weekend. She was celebrating. She was burning through my money on an extravagant shopping spree while quietly putting the final legal pieces in place to have me committed to a psychiatric facility for the rest of my life. I stared into the glowing screen and let the full enormity of her scheme settle into my exhausted mind. The truth worked like a floodlight, thrown suddenly into a dark room, illuminating every shadow corner of the past 10 years at once. I began to look back across the entire preceding decade with a clarity that was as sharp as it was terrifying. I thought about the chaotic early days right after Colton's accident. I had immediately hired the best private rehabilitation nurses that money could secure. I wanted a full dedicated medical team living under our roof to guarantee his comfort and give him every possible chance at recovery. But one by one, Nadine had systematically and ruthlessly let every single one of them go. She loudly declared the first nurse criminally negligent. She accused the second of stealing from her jewelry box. She claimed the third made Colton feel deeply uncomfortable in his own room. Within a single year, she had completely severed him from the outside medical world, making absolutely certain she was the sole person overseeing his daily care. She had just as methodically isolated me as well. Whenever I tried to review his medical charts, or whenever I suggested sitting in on his private sessions with Dr. Reeve Calloway, she would lay her hand softly against my chest and give a slow, sad shake of her head. "You are getting older, Gerald," she would say softly in that gently patronizing tone she had spent years perfecting. "Your blood pressure is already far too elevated from running the firm. You provide the vital support, and I will happily manage the medical stress. Leave the heavy lifting entirely to me." It was brilliant. It was a masterclass in calculated psychological manipulation. She had turned my advancing age, my demanding career, and my unconditional love for my family into a blindfold. She fitted over my eyes and pulled tight. I leaned in closer to the screen, my tired eyes narrowing as I pushed deeper into the archived transaction records covering the last 36 months. I was searching for the exact financial signature of her arrangement with Dr. Calloway. I scrolled past the routine household expenses, the regular utility payments, and the standing weekly grocery deliveries. Then I found it. It was buried deep inside the automated monthly bank transfers, disguised carefully as a recurring corporate property investment. On the 15th of every single month for the past 5 consecutive years, exactly $25,000 was being quietly siphoned from our joint investment portfolio directly into a private limited liability holding company. I leaned forward and highlighted the small text on the screen, my heart going completely cold as I read the registered corporate name aloud into the empty room. Callaway and V Real Estate. Callaway and V Real Estate. The name sat in my mind like the toll of a funeral bell. I closed the laptop gently, careful not to disturb Colton. He had finally surrendered to a deep, exhausted sleep on the other bed, his chest rising and falling with a slow, peaceful rhythm I had not witnessed in a decade. I pulled a spare blanket over his legs, confirmed the deadbolt was firmly thrown, and stepped out into the cold night air. I needed an unsecured public network. I drove my old Ford along the empty highway until a 24-hour diner's glowing sign cut through the darkness ahead. The little bell above the door chimed as I pushed inside. I settled into a sticky vinyl booth in the far corner and ordered a black coffee I had no plan to actually touch. I flipped open my laptop, tapped into the open network, and angled the screen away from the weary waitress working her way down the counter. My years in engineering had drilled into me how to chase structural failures down to the finest measurement, and financial fraud ran on exactly the same logic. You follow the stress lines until you hit the brake. I started with the man who had been feeding my son poison under the guise of medicine. I typed Dr. Reeve Callaway into the State Medical Board database. The first results handed back a perfectly polished professional profile, glowing testimonials, prestigious affiliations, the whole picture. But I knew precisely how to get underneath that surface. I ran his credentials through a federal registry and cross-referenced his prior addresses. That's when the clean facade started falling apart. 8 years before Nadine brought him through our front door, Callaway had his medical license quietly suspended in the state of Florida. The official disciplinary records were buried beneath thick layers of legal language, but the core offense was unmistakable. He had been investigated for severe medical malpractice, specifically the gross overprescription of powerful sedatives and highly experimental chemical compounds to deeply vulnerable patients. He had skirted federal prison only by voluntarily surrendering his state medical license and slipping away quietly. Nadine hadn't stumbled upon some miracle healer. She had gone out and deliberately recruited a disgraced, desperate man with a documented record of serious medical abuse. I pulled up the public property tax records for the greater Philadelphia area, hunting for the holding company I had just spotted on my wife's shared credit card statement, Callaway and V Real Estate. The results came up immediately and my jaw clenched so hard my back teeth ached. This disgraced, entirely unlicensed practitioner currently held 3 ultra-luxury residential penthouses right in the wealthy heart of the city. Their combined market value cleared $6 million without any difficulty. A private rehabilitation doctor serving a single paralyzed patient could never have built a real estate portfolio of that size through honest earnings. He wasn't drawing a regular salary. He was pulling a substantial cut from a much larger, highly organized criminal operation. But where was the original capital actually flowing from? My personal engineering wealth was considerable, yet I had kept a firm grip on my liquid cash. They were sourcing millions of dollars from somewhere else entirely. The answer hit me with the force of a freight train at full speed. My late brother, Edmund. Before Edmund lost his fight with aggressive pancreatic cancer 7 years ago, he had established a large, irrevocable medical trust fund dedicated entirely to his beloved nephew. That private trust had been funded with exactly $8 million legally earmarked to cover Colton's lifelong medical care, specialized mobility equipment, and any future reconstructive surgeries he might need. Because my schedule at the engineering firm left me stretched thin, and because I trusted the woman I had married without question, I had signed over primary administrative authority of that trust to Nadine. She was the legally designated custodial caregiver. She held complete unchecked control over how those funds were distributed, provided the expenditures were categorized as necessary medical treatments. I logged into the private wealth management portal using a secret administrative bypass code I had quietly built in when Edmund first had the legal documents drafted. I navigated straight to the main trust ledger, my hands hovered over the keyboard trembling. I drew a sharp breath and hit enter. 10 full years of detailed financial history populated the screen. I sat staring at the figures as a wave of deep, sickening nausea moved through me. It was an absolute financial massacre. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been methodically bled away month after month, year after grinding year. Every outgoing wire transfer had been personally authorized by Nadine and routed to various obscure shell companies wholly owned by Dr. Reeve Calloway. The expense categories were creative, elaborate, and entirely invented. Advanced experimental neurological stimulation therapy, highly specialized spinal cord, cellular regeneration protocols, advanced custom mobility equipment procurement. It was a sophisticated, immaculately documented paper trail built entirely on lies. Every dollar meant to give my son a fuller, more comfortable life had instead been used to pay a corrupt predator to keep him chemically imprisoned in a rusted wheelchair. They were actively billing the trust fund to continually poison the very person it existed to protect. I scrolled to the bottom of the ledger and checked the remaining balance. The red numbers confirmed everything I had feared most. The $8 million safety net my brother had lovingly constructed for his nephew was gone. Barely $30,000 remained. Nadine and Calloway had stripped the entire family fortune clean. But the final, most frightening piece of the picture was still unaccounted for. If the trust fund was exhausted, why was Nadine taking such an extreme and dangerous legal gamble right now? Why was she engineering an elaborate scheme to have me declared mentally incompetent and committed to a psychiatric facility? This coming Monday, I checked the date on the screen, then looked at the total estimated value of my remaining personal assets. My private investment portfolios, commercial real estate holdings, and the equity in our marital home came to roughly $4 million. As long as I remained legally competent, she couldn't lay a finger on any of it. My estate was protected by legal safeguards requiring my direct physical signature before any major assets could be liquidated. The full, terrifying shape of her timeline snapped into focus. She had completely drained Colton's trust fund. The golden goose was dead. Her lavish lifestyle, the expensive downtown hotel, stays the designer shopping, and Calloway's luxury real estate empire had all run out of fuel. She needed a new source of serious money, and she needed it now. I was the next target. I was the next target. The sheer chilling scale of her sociopathic greed settled into my tired bones. Every instinct I had screamed at me to grab my phone and call the police to get the truth in front of anyone who would hear it. But my analytical mind shut that impulse down fast. If I walked into a police precinct at 70 years old, raving about a decade-long conspiracy involving a respected medical specialist, a faked physical paralysis, and a hidden real estate empire, I would sound exactly like a man coming apart at the seams. I'd be handing her precisely what she needed. She already had the forged psychiatric evaluation, declaring me legally unsound. She was carefully constructing an airtight legal case to seize my remaining estate through forced conservatorship. A frantic, unsubstantiated police report would simply be the final nail I'd drive into my own coffin. I needed hard, physical, undeniable proof. I needed the actual substance she was using to keep my son compliant. I glanced across the dim room. Colton was sleeping soundly, his chest rising and falling in the quiet shadows of the cheap motel. I wrote out a careful set of detailed instructions on a sheet of thin motel stationery and left it beside a prepaid burner phone I'd picked up earlier at a lonely gas station. I secured the heavy deadbolt from outside and stepped out into the bitter Philadelphia night. I pointed my old rattling Ford back toward our affluent suburb, my mind locked entirely on what had to come next. The winding residential streets were completely empty at exactly 2 in the morning, washed in the pale yellow cast of the streetlights overhead. I parked 3 full blocks from my own property. The last thing I needed was to trip the motion-activated cameras mounted above the driveway. I moved silently through the cold, damp grass of the neighboring yards, closing in on my own home, like a stranger with no right to be there. The tall, custom-built brick structure looked imposing and deeply sinister in the dark. I got past the main exterior alarm by working the secondary utility box tucked behind the overgrown rhododendron bushes alongside the side gate. I had personally designed and installed that entire security grid exactly 5 years ago, which meant I knew precisely how to blind the exterior laser sensors without tripping a silent panic signal to the private monitoring company. I slipped through the heavy glass patio door and moved into the vast, utterly still kitchen. The house felt cold, hostile, and hollowed out. I navigated the dark hallways on pure muscle memory. Alone, I knew every inch of this place. I knew exactly which imported oak floorboards would betray me with a creak, and which ones would hold their silence. I moved with agonizing deliberateness, my heart hammering hard against my ribs, until I reached the heavy mahogany door of Nadine's private home office. She kept it locked, without exception. I drew a thin steel tension wrench and a small picking hook from my jacket pocket tools I'd regularly use for calibrating precision engineering instruments. Within 40 seconds, the brass lock gave a loud click and released. I stepped inside, pulled the door shut behind me, and switched on my heavy LED inspection light. The tight beam swept across her spotless, carefully arranged glass desk. My gut told me she was keeping the actual medication somewhere in this room. I worked through every wooden drawer, every locked filing cabinet, every decorative box on the shelves. Nothing. I planted myself in the middle of the dark room and thought like an engineer. I studied the load-bearing walls, hunting for any spatial irregularity or structural anomaly. My eyes settled on a large, heavy oil painting, hanging perfectly centered on the far wall. I lifted the ornate frame off its brass hooks and set it carefully on the carpet. A flush-mounted steel wall safe looked back at me. Older model mechanical combination, highly dependable. I had no idea what the combination was, but a lifetime in structural work gives you a finely tuned sensitivity to internal acoustics and metal friction. I pulled a standard medical stethoscope from my worn leather satchel, a simple tool I'd picked up at an all-night pharmacy on the drive over. I pressed the flat acoustic piece against the safe door, right beside the brass dial, and fitted the earpieces snugly into my ears. I closed my eyes and began turning the dial with excruciating slowness. I listened for the faint, distinct clicks of the internal tumblers dropping into their machine slots. It demanded absolute patience and total physical concentration. Click. That was the first tumbler. I immediately reversed the rotation, tracking the delicate scrape of brass on steel. Click. The second tumbler settled into place. I rotated the dial one final deliberate turn to the right. A heavy resonant clunk carried clearly through the stethoscope. I gripped the steel handle and pulled down hard. The safe door swung open with a soft, satisfying sigh. I brought the beam inside. 4 unmarked transparent plastic bottles sat there. Every original pharmaceutical label had been stripped clean off. Then the distinct sound of the front door unlocking rang through the silent house. My heart lurched violently. The front door had just closed, and heavy footsteps were already crossing the hardwood floor of the main foyer, not the sharp, measured click of Nadine's heels. These were heavy, fast, and unmistakably male. I had only seconds. I lunged at the open safe and snatched all 4 unmarked bottles, driving them deep into the inside pockets of my jacket. I swept my hand across the glass desk and grabbed the thick brown accordion folder, holding the forged psychiatric evaluations I'd spotted moments earlier. I needed somewhere to hide, and I needed it immediately. The office gave me almost nothing to work with. My eyes found the tall, louvered mahogany doors of a walk-in storage closet tucked into the far corner of the room. I crossed the Persian carpet in a few quick strides and threw myself into the narrow darkness of the closet just as the brass handle on the office door began to turn. I pulled the louvered door shut, leaving a hair's-width gap to see through. I pressed my back flat against the plaster wall and stopped breathing entirely. The office door swung open hard. The overhead lights blazed on, flooding the room with harsh brightness that stung my eyes through the wooden slats. As my vision steadied, I recognized the intruder. It wasn't my wife. It was Dr. Reeve Calloway. He looked nothing like the composed, unhurried professional who usually drifted into our home with his leather medical bag. Tonight, his expensive tailored jacket was wrinkled and stained, his silk tie was yanked loose around his neck, and a heavy slick of sweat sheened his pale forehead. He was breathing hard, dark eyes sweeping frantically across every corner of the room. He went straight to the glass desk, completely oblivious to the open wall safe behind him, driven entirely by blind panic. He ripped through the stacked paperwork, hurling personalized stationery and leather-bound financial ledgers onto the floor without slowing down. I watched every frantic movement from the dark, measuring him carefully. He was tearing the room apart, searching for the exact folder pressed against my chest. He swore loudly, a sharp, vicious sound that cut through the quiet of my home like a blade. He drove his fist down onto the glass desktop and paced in tight, agitated circles like a cornered animal. After a long stretch of fruitless searching, he shoved a hand into his trouser pocket, yanked out his phone, and jabbed hard at the screen. He hit speakerphone and dropped the device onto the cluttered desk. The ringing tone filled the room. Nadine picked up on the second ring. Her voice came through sharp and irritated, stripped entirely of its usual smooth warmth. "Reeve, what exactly is taking you so long?" she demanded. "Did you get the documents from the desk?" Dr. Calloway leaned over the phone, his pale face tight with barely contained fury. "I am looking right now, Nadine. The files are not where you said they would be. I need those forged psychiatric evaluations in my hands tonight. You told me they were finalized and sitting right here on the desk." Nadine sighed loudly through the crackling speaker. "They are there, Reeve. Stop being hysterical. Stop panicking and look properly. I left them right beside the lamp. We cannot afford stupid mistakes this close to the end." "I am not panicking," Calloway hissed, sweeping a stack of thick envelopes off the desk onto the floor. "I am trying to lock down our investment. If I don't have those legal papers in my briefcase by tomorrow morning, our entire timeline falls apart. We need to file them with the court immediately." By Monday noon, the judge grants the medical conservatorship. The moment that gavel comes down, Gerald is legally erased from existence. The police drag him straight to the locked psychiatric ward, and we finally have full uncontested access to the rest of his $4 million estate. My blood went stone cold. Hearing their plan laid out in precise, deliberate terms spoken aloud inside my own home was a violation so profound it reached somewhere beyond rage. They had mapped out my complete destruction with the relaxed matter-of-fact tone of people going over a grocery list. I tightened my grip on the thick brown accordion folder, the physical proof of their coming crime hidden safely in the dark alongside me. I closed my eyes for a moment and steadied my breathing. The damning conversation was far from finished. Nadine's voice shifted suddenly, icy clinical, stripped of anything resembling humanity. "Once Gerald is permanently locked away, we have to deal with the boy right away," she said. "Colton has been moving far too much lately. He complained to me this morning about his legs burning. He is building a tolerance to the current chemical mixture." Calloway groaned, dragging a trembling hand through his thinning hair. "I know, Nadine. I noticed the muscle spasms during my last evaluation. The nerve blocks are starting to fail. Once his meddling father is out of the picture, we can finally push the dosage higher. We'll double the compound in his evening pills. It'll completely destroy his motor function within 48 hours. He'll be a fully compliant vegetable, and we won't have to worry about him trying to stand again." "Okay," Nadine said. "Just get the papers and get out of the house. Meet me back at the hotel suite." Calloway cut the call. He turned his head slowly, dark eyes moving across the room. Then his gaze stopped directly on the louvered mahogany doors of the storage closet. My heart froze completely. He took one slow, deliberate step toward me. I reached out silently in the darkness. My fingers closed around a heavy metal paperweight, ready to swing. Dr. Reeve Calloway gripped the brass handle of the closet door with his damp palm. My knuckles went white around the metal. Every muscle in my body coiled tight, bracing for the confrontation. I pressed myself back into the suffocating darkness, fully prepared to drive that paperweight into his skull the instant the door came open. The hinges had just begun to creak when a sharp ringtone tore through the tension. Calloway recoiled violently, jerking his hand away from the door. He lurched back across the carpet and snatched his glowing phone from the glass desk. It was Nadine calling back. Her voice had become a panicked shriek through the small speaker. "Get out of there right now," she screamed. "The private security company just called about a power fluctuation on the exterior sensors. If Gerald triggered an alarm, the police could already be on their way. Grab whatever files you can find and leave immediately." Calloway fell apart completely. He shoved the phone into his jacket and abandoned his search for the forged documents I was clutching tightly against my chest. He grabbed a random armful of irrelevant billing invoices off the floor, stuffed them into his leather briefcase, and bolted out of the office. I tracked his heavy footsteps hammering down the hallway. Seconds later, the front door slammed with a deep resonant thud, followed by the screech of tires tearing out of the driveway. I let out a shaking, ragged breath, my whole body trembling from the adrenaline flooding through me. I waited 3 full agonizing minutes in the dark closet before I was certain the house was empty. I pushed the louvered doors open and stepped carefully back into the lit office. I tucked the brown accordion folder with the forged psychiatric evaluations and the 4 unmarked pill bottles securely inside my winter jacket. I moved through the silent house, slipped out the back patio door, and disappeared into the cold shadows of the sleeping neighborhood. When I reached my old Ford pickup, I dropped into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I didn't head back to the rundown roadside inn straight away. I had one urgent stop that couldn't wait. My engineering mind was running at full capacity now. I needed hard scientific proof of exactly what chemical poison they had been pushing into my son every single night. I pushed through the empty expressways and drove directly to a discreet 24-hour private testing laboratory on the industrial outskirts of the city. The facility was owned by Leonard Quaid, a brilliant chemical engineer and a deeply trusted retired colleague. I had personally helped Leonard secure the structural permits for that exact building over a decade ago. I knew he kept late hours. He preferred the deep silence of the night for his complex analytical work. I pulled into the empty lot and knocked my fist hard against the reinforced steel security door. Leonard answered after a long minute. He had on a stained white lab coat, thick glasses pushed up on his forehead. "Gerald," he asked, his tired eyes going wide with surprise. "What in the world are you doing here at this hour?" I moved past him into the bright laboratory. "I don't have time for formalities, Leonard. I need your expertise, and I need this kept entirely off the books." I reached into my jacket and set the 4 unmarked plastic pill bottles down on his stainless steel examination table. Leonard studied the capsules, his professional instincts immediately engaged. "What exactly are these, Gerald?" I pulled a thick stack of $100 bills directly from my worn leather satchel. It was exactly $6,000 in cold cash money I had withdrawn during my initial escape. I pushed the stack across the cold metal table. "I don't know what's in them, Leonard, but I believe they are toxic, unregulated neurotoxins. I need a full expedited chemical analysis. I need to know every compound inside those capsules, and I need the toxicology report in my hands within 24 hours. No questions about where they came from." Leonard looked at the cash, then looked straight into my eyes. He gave a slow nod, sliding both the bottles and the money to his side of the table. "I'll run the mass spectrometer immediately, Gerald. You'll have your answers by morning." I thanked him quickly and walked back out into the freezing Philadelphia wind. I checked the dashboard clock. It was exactly 5 Asunder in the morning. The sky was just beginning to go a deep bruised purple at the edges. I had one final critical stop before I could get back to my son. I put the truck in gear and drove hard toward the affluent gated communities of the main line. I was going straight to the home of Conrad Fielding. Conrad wasn't only my primary corporate attorney, he was a ferociously loyal, ruthless legal strategist who had shielded my engineering firm from predatory lawsuits for over 20 years. He was the only man alive I trusted to navigate what was coming. I pulled into his driveway and walked straight up the stone steps. I beat my fist against the heavy oak front door without hesitation or apology. I didn't care who I woke. I kept pounding until my knuckles burned with a steady throbbing ache. After 3 long minutes, the door jerked open. Conrad stood there in a silk bathrobe, gray-haired, disheveled face, flushed with the anger of a man dragged out of a deep sleep. "Gerald, have you lost your mind?" he hissed, pulling his robe tight. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" I stepped past him and walked straight into his grand marble-floored foyer. "There's no time to sleep, Conrad," I said, moving with purpose directly into his formal dining room. I upended my leather satchel onto the polished mahogany table. The forged psychiatric evaluations and the printed financial records showing the gutted trust funds spread out under the overhead light. Conrad moved closer to the table, his sharp legal instincts immediately reading what the documents meant. "What is all this, Gerald?" he whispered, visibly shaken. I looked him straight in the eyes. "Conrad, I have exactly 48 hours before my wife strips away my mind, my freedom, and kills my son. We are going to war." Conrad stood motionless in the foyer, his sleep-starved eyes locked onto the pile of papers across the table. He reached out slowly and lifted the forged psychiatric evaluation bearing Dr. Reeve Calloway's signature. I watched the full weight of it register his expression, moving from stunned confusion to cold, calculating fury. He set it down carefully and picked up the financial ledger, showing the entirely drained $8 million trust fund. He looked up at me, the color gone from his face. "Gerald, this is a meticulously constructed legal guillotine. What I was about to hear in that room would change the entire weight of everything I thought I understood about my own family. Before I tell you what came next and what it would demand of me to survive, let me ask you this. If someone you loved was quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you found out? Or would you wait and build your case in silence?" He whispered, his voice carrying equal parts professional awe and deep personal revulsion. She has built a perfectly documented false narrative of severe dementia and escalating paranoia. If Nadine walks into the probate courthouse Monday morning and files this petition first, you are completely dead in the water. He began pacing the polished floor, bare feet slapping softly against the cold marble. The brutal reality of conservatorship law is unforgiving, Gerald. The moment a judge stamps this emergency medical order, you lose every fundamental human right. You have. You won't be permitted to retain your own attorney. You won't be able to touch your own accounts. You won't even be allowed to legally contest your own forced institutionalization. The police will simply show up at your door, put you in restraints, and deliver you straight to a locked psychiatric ward. And the worst of it is that she instantly gains full legal control over your $4 million estate and total medical authority over Colton. We have under 48 hours before the county clerk opens. We cannot sit back and play defense. If we wait for her to file first, we'll be trapped in a legal stranglehold for years, and Colton will not survive that timeline. I stood completely still, letting the full chill of his assessment settle over me. What's our countermove, Conrad? I asked, my voice holding steady despite the storm of panic building in my chest. Conrad stopped pacing and drove both hands flat onto the table. We ambush her, he said, his eyes burning with hard resolve. We tear apart her entire operation before she gets anywhere near those courthouse steps. He strode straight into his home office silk bathrobe and all, and powered up his desktop computer. I'm drafting a stack of emergency counter-injunctions right now, he called out over the hum of the machine. I'll personally file for a temporary restraining order against Nadine and Dr. Calloway the second a duty judge is reachable, but we need heavy immediate ammunition to ensure they're arrested on the spot. He grabbed his phone from the charging dock and punched in a specific unlisted number. I've got a long-owed favor to collect from Captain Bauer at the Financial Crimes Division, he explained while it rang. He's a relentless investigator who has zero tolerance for medical fraud. Conrad laid out the full embezzlement scheme to the sleepy captain, the $8 million theft, the hidden luxury real estate portfolio held by Calloway. By the time he ended the call 30 minutes later, the trap was set. Captain Bauer was quietly assembling a task force to freeze the hidden accounts and prepare felony arrest warrants for large-scale financial fraud and attempted medical homicide. We were going to bring the full weight of the law down on both of them. I left Conrad hammering out legal petitions in his dark office and drove my rattling truck back through the waking city. The morning sun was just beginning to edge over the horizon, throwing pale light across the empty industrial streets. I turned into the rundown roadside inn parking lot, my chest aching with a raw, desperate need to see my boy. I unlocked the deadbolt and pushed the door open. Colton was sitting bolt upright on the edge of the sagging mattress, gripping the bed sheets with white-knuckled terror. His face was completely drained of color, slick with sweat, his breathing fast and shallow. "Dad?" he gasped, his voice cracking. "I thought she'd found us. I thought you were never coming back." I crossed the small room fast and pulled my grown son into a fierce, tight embrace. He pressed his face into my winter jacket, his whole frame shaking with years of pent-up trauma and raw fear. I held him, close arms wrapped around him, resting my chin on top of his head. For the first time in 10 long, agonizing years, a single hot tear ran down my face. Not grief, determination. "I'm right here, Colton," I whispered into the quiet room, pulling him closer. "I will never leave you alone with them again. You are safe." I drew back and looked directly into his exhausted, frightened eyes. "You walked today, son," I said, my voice thick with a pride I couldn't contain. "You fought through 10 years of chemical torture and you walked. Tomorrow you're going to stand tall and watch them burn." Colton looked back at me, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, a small, fragile spark of real hope broke through the fear in his eyes. He gave a slow nod, his breathing beginning to settle in the quiet of the hidden room. I reached into my pocket for the prepaid burner phone I'd left him, intending to check for any messages from Conrad. Before my hand closed around it, my own phone vibrated sharply against my hip. The sudden buzz made us both flinch. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was Leonard Quaid calling from the private laboratory. I answered immediately, my chest drawing tight. "Leonard, what did you find?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. A long, heavy silence followed on the other end of the line. When Leonard finally spoke, his normally steady, analytical voice was shaking. "Gerald," he said, breathing hard into the receiver, I ran the compounds through the mass spectrometer 3 separate times to be certain. This is not human medications, Gerald. The primary active ingredient is a tightly regulated synthetic paralytics used exclusively in large animal veterinary practice. It's a severe neuromuscular blocking agent designed for euthanizing massive livestock. Where in the world did you get this? I stood completely still in the quiet hallway of the motel, phone pressed hard against my ear. Leonard's horrified voice rang through the speaker, cracking apart the last of what I thought I knew. The capsules contained no form of human medicine whatsoever. What they held was a potent synthetic chemical engineered to slowly paralyze large agricultural animals. Leonard explained, his voice taut with professional revulsion, that prolonged repeated exposure to this specific compound would methodically destroy human muscle tissue, driving the body into deep paralysis and wrapping the mind in a heavy neurological fog. Nadine, the woman I had given my entire life to, had been poisoning our own child. She had carefully administered heavy-grade animal tranquilizers to our son every single night for an entire decade. I thanked Leonard in a hollow whisper and ended the call. The sheer unqualified evil of what she had done pressed down on my chest like something physical. I walked back into the formal dining room, where Conrad was working through the mountain of forged documents and financial records I'd pulled from the safe. He had already called in his trusted private investigator, a retired federal agent named Garrett, who sat quietly at the long mahogany table, running Nadine's financial history through a classified digital database, hunting for hidden offshore accounts or secret property holdings tied to Callaway. We sat in tense silence as the morning sun climbed. Around noon, Garrett stopped typing. He pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose and let out a slow, sharp breath. "Gerald," he said quietly, his tone carrying a dark weight that sent a fresh wave of cold straight through me. "I found something buried deep inside the archived bank records you pulled from the safe. This isn't another real estate purchase or a hidden offshore transfer to the doctor." Garrett turned his laptop around so Conrad and I could both see the screen. He pointed to a specific heavily encrypted wire transfer originating from Nadine's personal checking account. The digital timestamp was precise. A payment of exactly $50,000 in cash, permanently processed exactly 10 years ago. I leaned in close, my tired eyes moving carefully across the black text on the screen. The transfer had gone through on a Tuesday in late August. It was exactly 48 hours before Colton was set to pack his bags and drive across the country to start his freshman year at Duke University. It was exactly 2 days before the catastrophic vehicle crash that supposedly severed his spinal cord and destroyed his future forever. Who exactly received this money? I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous rasp. Garrett pulled up the associated routing numbers and the corresponding business license. The recipient was a shady independent automotive mechanic running a failing garage on the industrial outskirts of the city. He shut down his shop abruptly and left the state entirely less than 1 week after Colton's accident. The monstrous truth snapped into place, lighting up the absolute darkest corner of my wife's black soul. The crash was not a tragic accident. It was a deliberate, carefully engineered hit. She had planned it meticulously to cripple him. Nadine had paid a desperate mechanic to cut the brake lines on our son's car. She had tried to severely maim or kill her own child, simply to ensure he would never leave her house. If Colton had made it to college, she would have lost her legally designated role as his custodial caregiver. She would have lost her unrestricted access to the $8 million medical trust fund my late brother had established for him. Her entire motive was rooted in cold psychopathic greed. She had deliberately destroyed her own son's spine, and then spent the next 10 years feeding him livestock tranquilizers, keeping her grip locked tight on the family fortune. Something inside my engineer's mind broke loose at that moment, grief giving way entirely to cold, focused fury. I was no longer just a betrayed husband or a heartbroken father. I was a predator with a target, and I was going to destroy the people who had done this to my family. I turned to Conrad, my hands balled into shaking fists. "We are not just going to arrest them, Conrad. We are going to obliterate everything they've built." Conrad nodded slowly, a hard, predatory smile moving across his face. He immediately got back on the line with Captain Bauer and his task force, laying the legal and tactical groundwork for the trap we were about to spring. I drove back to the rundown roadside inn to check on my son. Colton was sitting upright in the bed, watching the door with wide, frightened eyes. I sat down beside him and put my hands firmly on his shoulders. I told him all of it: the animal tranquilizers, the gutted trust fund, the tampered brakes. I watched the last remnants of his childhood innocence drain away and harden into something new. I pulled him into a tight, fierce embrace. "You walked yesterday, son." I told him, the words carrying every ounce of the promise behind them. "Tomorrow you're going to stand tall and watch them burn to the ground." We spent the rest of the weekend in that hidden room, quietly preparing, waiting for the moment to execute our ambush against the woman who had stolen our lives. Sunday evening finally came, drawing long shadows across the sprawling city. I sat on the edge of the cheap motel mattress, staring at the glowing face of my phone. The clock turned to 6:00 in the evening. Right on schedule, a text message lit up the screen. It was from Nadine. The tone was sickeningly warm, her performance perfectly intact. "Heading home early from the Finger Lakes, honey. I miss you both so much. See you in exactly an hour." She had no idea her empire of lies had already crumbled, that the police were positioned in the shadows, that her chosen victim had become her executioner. I took a slow, deep breath and felt a profound, icy calm move through me. My hands were completely steady as I typed my reply, the words designed to walk her directly into the center of our trap. "We are waiting in the living room for you." I sent it and set the phone face down on the end table. I looked up at my son. Colton was standing straight and still beside the stone fireplace, free from the rusted wheelchair that had held him for an entire decade. He was wearing a dark, well-tailored suit I'd bought him just the day before. His shoulders were squared, his chin level and high. The physical transformation was extraordinary. Without the veterinary paralytic running through him every night, his natural strength and youth had surged back fast. The neurological fog had lifted completely from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, steady intensity. We stood together in the pitch-black living room, waiting in total silence. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn shut, the entire lower floor swallowed in darkness. I settled back into my leather armchair, resting a warm cup of black coffee on my knee. The wait felt endless. Then the crunch of tires rolling slowly across the gravel driveway cut through the quiet night. I drew a slow breath and felt my pulse settle into a calm, deliberate rhythm. Headlights swept across the curtains, and the heavy engine of a large van idled briefly before going quiet. The sharp thud of a car door, then a second, a third, a fourth. They had arrived exactly as Conrad and I had anticipated. Heavy footsteps crossed the concrete walkway toward the front porch, far too many for just Nadine and Dr. Calloway. She had brought exactly what we expected, hired muscle to carry out her plan. The familiar jingle of her house keys drifted through the oak door. The brass lock clicked, and the front door swung open with a low groan. Cool night air moved into the dark foyer, carrying the faint trace of Nadine's expensive floral perfume. I sat perfectly still in the shadow of the living room, holding my coffee mug. Beside me, I heard Colton take a quiet, steadying breath. Nadine stepped carefully into the dark hallway. She didn't reach for the light switch right away. Instead, she let out a long, practiced sigh and slipped into her performance. "Gerald," she called out, her voice layered with fabricated anguish. "Honey, are you in here? We are so worried about you." Her heels clicked softly against the hardwood as she moved another step forward. It was a masterclass in manipulation, engineered to sound like a loving wife, desperate to save her ailing husband. "Please don't be frightened, Gerald," she went on, her voice cracking with counterfeit emotion. "I brought Dr. Calloway with me. He's right here to help. Your mind is slipping, darling. You're confused and you need immediate psychiatric care. We're taking you somewhere you can finally rest." The scuff of heavy boots across the foyer rug followed. Two broad-shouldered men filed in behind Dr. Calloway, dressed in dark blue uniforms that resembled private paramedics, but carried themselves like hired enforcers. They had canvas restraints and thick leather straps, fully prepared to haul me out of my own home. Dr. Calloway cleared his throat in the darkness. "Mr. Hartley," he said, reaching for an authoritative tone, "please stay calm. We have the official emergency medical orders right here. You are experiencing a severe psychotic break. We need you to come with us quietly." I said nothing. I lifted my coffee mug slowly and took a long, unhurried sip. The soft clink of ceramic against the saucer rang out in the silence. Nadine's breath caught. Her head turned sharply toward the dark living room. "Gerald," she whispered, moving toward the archway. She found the light switch and pressed it. The crystal chandelier blazed to life overhead, flooding the room with brilliant sudden light. Nadine stepped fully inside, a rehearsed look of sad, pitying concern fixed on her face. That expression froze the instant she saw the room. Her eyes went wide, enormous, terrified circles of pure shock. The designer purse dropped from her fingers and struck the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. Her jaw fell slack, her breath caught entirely in her throat. She wasn't looking at me sitting calmly in my armchair. She was staring past me at the impossible figure standing tall beside the stone fireplace. Colton. He wasn't leaning on anything. No wheelchair, no wall, nothing, just standing there on his own 2 feet, glaring down at his mother with naked, unfiltered contempt. Those broad shoulders of his squared off the crisp lines of a brand new suit, and his legs held him solid as bedrock. 10 years of chemical torture, and you wouldn't have known it to look at him. He was every inch the image of recovered strength, a living rebuke, righteous and immovable. "Mother," Colton said, his voice low and rock-steady, threaded through with a cold fury barely held in check. "You seem shocked that I'm on my feet." Dr. Calloway lurched back against the doorframe, like he'd been shoved, every drop of color vanishing from his face in an instant. A weak, strangled sound escaped his throat, and his eyes jumped wildly back and forth between Colton standing tall and the vacant corner where that rusted old wheelchair normally sat. The 2 men posing as paramedics edged instinctively toward the open front door, all that manufactured aggression draining right out of them the moment they understood this was not the helpless, addled old man their payday had promised. Nadine came apart. The polished, controlled exterior she'd worn for years shattered into something unrecognizable, raw animal fear written across every feature. "Colton?" She choked out, her voice reduced to a thin, trembling squeak. "How? That can't be. You can't walk. You're paralyzed." I set my coffee mug down on the end table without hurry and leaned forward in my chair. "He's on his feet because he stopped swallowing your veterinary-grade tranquilizers, Nadine," I said, and my voice didn't waver. It landed like a blade. "Every last thing you've done, we know it all." Nadine shrieked. She whipped around and made a desperate break for the front door, but she never got there. Conrad Fielding materialized out of the kitchen's shadows, moving smoothly into the light, a thick sheaf of signed legal warrants held right in his hand, and a look of quiet triumph settled across his face. Behind him, filling the doorway, stood Captain Bauer, and 3 uniformed officers' hands resting easy on their utility belts. Nadine went rigid at the sight of the badges, her carefully kept hands shaking at her sides. The trap springing shut had stolen the air clean out of her. But a woman like her doesn't fold without reaching for one last weapon. I could see it happening, the calculation flickering back to life behind those frightened eyes. She pulled a breath, and something in her posture shifted. The terror dropped away like a curtain, coming down, swapped out for a performance of pure theatrical grief. She covered her face with both hands and released a wail that rang off the living room ceiling. "What are you people doing to him?" she screamed, jabbing a trembling finger in my direction, her face contorted in manufactured horror. "He cannot stand on his own. He is paralyzed. You're forcing him upright against his will. Officers, my husband needs to be placed under arrest right now. He has lost his grip on reality completely. He is in the middle of a psychotic episode, and he is torturing our disabled child. Please, somebody has to stop him before he does permanent damage to my son's spine." She surged forward, arms outstretched, trying to seize Colton and drag him back into the chemical cage she'd built for him. Captain Bauer planted himself squarely in her path, an immovable wall of authority between that frantic woman and my boy. One raised hand flat firm, and she was stopped. Nadine collapsed into loud, heaving sobs, face buried in her palms, performing the role of the devastated, wronged mother with a skill that turned the stomach. Between wails, she begged Dr. Calloway to back up her medical fiction in front of the officers. Dr. Calloway, though, couldn't move. Terror had him nailed to the doorframe. His gaze was locked on that thick stack of legal warrants sitting in Conrad Fielding's hands, and he understood with perfect clarity what every stamped page meant for what remained of his life. The real estate empire he'd built from stolen money, the fake medical credentials propping it all up. He could watch it all go to ash in real time. The 2 men who'd come dressed as paramedics had the same realization hit them like a wall. They'd strolled straight into a federal net. Their canvas restraints hit the floor. Both men lifted their hands slowly and pressed back toward the foyer walls without a word. Hired muscle has limits, and federal prison wasn't part of the arrangement. Nadine's shrieking kept on filling the room, a frantic drowning attempt to muddy the truth before it finished closing over her head. Then it stopped, silenced by a single voice, utterly calm. "Mother, stop the act, right now." It wasn't me. It wasn't Captain Bauer. It was Colton, deep unhurried, carrying a quiet authority that left no room for argument. Nadine went perfectly still, the sobbing cut off mid-breath, like someone had thrown a switch. She let her hands fall slowly, and she looked up at the sun she had poisoned day after day for a full decade. Colton held her gaze, and there was nothing in his face. No grief, no residual love, no trace of the frightened boy she'd kept bedridden. He regarded her the way a judge regards a defendant whose guilt is already written in the record. "I've been wide awake and fully aware for 3 months, Mother." He said each word, precise and measured, cutting through the room's tension like a scalpel. "Every phone call you whispered from the hallway outside my door in the dark, I heard every one. Every complaint you muttered about how slowly I was deteriorating, I caught every word. I know the full plan, the forced medical conservatorship you intend to file Monday morning, and I know exactly what you did to the private trust fund my Uncle Edmund set aside to look after me, how you bled it dry, piece by piece." Nadine's lips parted, but nothing came out. The color left her face entirely, her complexion, fading to a sickly grayish-white pallor. She had the look of an animal that has just felt the trap clamp down and understood there is no direction left to run. She threw a desperate glance back at Dr. Calloway, hunting for any lifeline, but the disgraced doctor was already lifting his trembling hands above his head as the officers closed in around him from behind. I rose from the leather armchair, slowly straightening the front of my jacket with one deliberate pass of my hand. No raised voice, no outburst. Not one flicker of the white-hot rage churning inside my chest made it to the surface. Every movement I made was measured, precise, intentional. I reached into my leather satchel and drew out the mountain of documented proof that Conrad and I had spent the entire sleepless night putting together. I walked to the center of the room and dropped the whole stack squarely onto the glass coffee table. The papers hit with a crack that rang through the brightly lit room. I spread them open across the surface so that every person in that room could see exactly what was there. "These are the highly encrypted offshore bank statements," Gerald said, my voice carrying the flat final weight of a door swinging shut. "They show every illicit wire transfer you signed off on, draining my brother's $8 million trust fund month after month until there was nothing left. Beside those records are the certified property deeds that trace Dr. Calloway's hidden luxury real estate portfolio directly back to the funds that were supposed to guarantee my son's care for life. And here," I pressed my finger down on the thick brown accordion folder, tapping it hard, "are the forged psychiatric evaluations you had constructed to have me declared incompetent, committed, and stripped of everything I have left." I let the silence stretch, let the full weight of their ruin press down on them. Captain Bauer gave his officers a quiet nod, and they moved forward, drawing heavy steel handcuffs from their belts. Nadine's breathing turned ragged, short, shallow gasps as the gilded life she'd built on theft and poison caved in around her. She stumbled back, her heels snagging on the thick Persian rug. But I wasn't done yet. The one piece of evidence that would hit hardest was still folded in my inside pocket. I slid my hand into the lining of my winter jacket and drew out a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, thick stock. It was the formal chemical analysis that Leonard Quaid had produced at the secure private laboratory. I raised it up into the full blaze of the crystal chandelier, angling it so that Nadine and Dr. Calloway could read every word of those unforgiving black-printed results. "And this," I said, voice dropping to a low, hard whisper that pulled silence from every person in that room, "is the official expedited toxicology report. It removes every shadow of legal or moral doubt about what you've been doing behind closed doors. This is the heavy-grade veterinary tranquilizer, the severe muscular atrophy agent you have been deliberately and systematically administering to him for 3,600 days. The silence that crashed down after that revelation was total, hanging over the bright living room like a suffocating cloud that nobody dared to breathe through. Dr. Reeve Calloway fixed his gaze on the printed chemical analysis in my hand, his eyes blown wide with raw, cornered panic. Every trace of the smug, calculated professional had vanished. What remained was a desperate criminal watching his entire world come apart at the seams. Without warning, Calloway let out a guttural shout, hurled his heavy leather briefcase at the nearest officer, and bolted for the front door. He didn't get far. Captain Bauer moved with the instinctive speed of a man who has done this 1,000 times. He stepped swiftly into the foyer, wrapped both arms around Calloway's midsection, and drove him hard into the polished hardwood. The crash was heavy enough to tremble the crystal chandelier overhead. 2 uniformed officers piled on, immediately pinning his thrashing limbs and snapping steel handcuffs around his pale wrists. The pair of men who'd arrived in paramedic uniforms, now fully understanding the scale of the federal machinery they'd stumbled into, backed out the front door with their hands raised high, offering nothing in the way of resistance as the remaining officers walked them straight to the waiting patrol cars. Nadine stood there and watched the empire she'd spent a decade constructing collapse into rubble in a matter of seconds. The chemical proof of what she'd done to her own son lay spread across the glass table, and her chief accomplice was face down on the floor in irons. She sank slowly to her knees in the center of the plush Persian rug, the fine fabric of her designer dress settling around her. And then she reached for the one weapon she had left. Loud, heaving sobs. Manufactured tears streaking carefully down her perfectly composed cheeks. She tilted her face up toward me and then toward Colton, her voice trembling with a performance of maternal anguish, so practiced it was almost impressive almost. "I did it for us," she wailed, pressing both hands hard against her chest, like a woman absorbing a mortal wound. "You have to believe me, Gerald. All I ever wanted was to hold this family together under one roof." He was going to load up a car and drive off to some massive university in California and never look back. He was going to leave me behind in this enormous empty house without a second thought. I couldn't live with the thought of losing my boy. I couldn't face it. I did what any mother pushed to the very edge would do. I only wanted to keep him safe, to keep him close. I stood where I was looking down at her from a cold, composed distance. This woman I had spent years loving without question, trusting without limit. There was nothing left in my chest that resembled mercy. My rage was real and absolute, but I kept it locked away. Not a flicker of it escaped into my face or my voice. I moved around the edge of the coffee table with slow, deliberate steps and came to a stop directly in front of her kneeling form. With careful precision, I pulled another set of documents from my jacket and laid them onto the glass surface. "These are your encrypted offshore account records, the luxury property deeds held under Calloway's name, and the forged conservatorship paperwork. But we're not done yet." I reached back into my pocket and withdrew the single document that Conrad Fielding and his private investigator had dug out from the deepest, most carefully buried layer of your financial history. A faded banking record from 10 years ago, clipped to a handwritten invoice from a backstreet automotive garage on the grimy industrial edge of the city. I dropped it in front of her. The paper drifted down and settled on the carpet between her shaking knees. Nadine looked down at the faded ink, and the crying stopped not gradually, but instantly swapped out for a sudden, suffocating inability to draw a breath. "That is the billing record from the crooked mechanic you paid off exactly 10 years ago." I said, my voice quiet and perfectly level, each word landing like a stone. "The offshore transfer of exactly $50,000 in untraceable funds cleared exactly 2 days before our son was due to drive himself to Duke University. You didn't simply want him home, Nadine. You wanted uncontested control over the $8 million medical trust my late brother Edmund had set up for his nephew's future. You understood that the moment Colton walked out of this house as a healthy, self-sufficient young man, your legal role as his custodial caregiver would dissolve overnight. Your designer wardrobe, your luxury hotel, weekends, your lifestyle built on his money, all of it gone. You would have lost access to that fortune permanently. So you engineered a catastrophe. You paid a desperate mechanic to cut the brake lines on Colton's vehicle. You deliberately caused that crash on that rainy afternoon. You intentionally shattered your own son's spine so you could steal his $8 million. You wiped out his entire future without a flicker of remorse. And then you spent 3,600 days feeding him veterinary-grade tranquilizers to make absolutely certain he never stood up again. The room went dead. The kind of silence that presses on your ears. The full enormity of what Nadine had done settled over everyone present like a physical weight. Even the veteran officers holding position in the foyer looked shaken, their hard faces pulling into expressions of visible disgust at the trembling woman kneeling on the rug. Nadine didn't try to deny it. She dragged her eyes off the mechanic's invoice and lifted them to the figure standing by the tall stone fireplace. She stretched one trembling manicured hand toward him, her voice fracturing into a broken, desperate whisper. "Colton, my sweet baby, please listen to me right now." Colton looked down at the woman who had stolen a decade of his life. He didn't flinch. He didn't soften. He took one slow, deliberate step backward, drawing the hem of his jacket out of reach of her grasping fingers, as if her touch carried something corrosive. He stood at his full height, composed unshakable every inch the person she had spent 10 years trying to erase. His expression gave her nothing. The same blank, unfeeling wall she had shown him every day for 3,600 days returned to her now without apology. Nadine stared up at him, mascara-wrecked eyes wide and begging, her mouth open to try once more to spin one final story, pull one final thread of manipulation. But the living room's crushing quiet was broken before she could form the words split apart by the calm, unwavering voice of my son. "You are not my mother." Colton's tone carried no heat, no trembling, no residue of the child he had been. "You are my warden. You are someone who deliberately engineered a horrific tragedy and then watched me rot in a rusted cage while you spent my future on yourself. For 10 years, I was conscious inside a chemical prison. You built around me fully aware of everything, completely unable to break free from what you'd done." He let that sit in the air for a moment, then turned his eyes toward the waiting officers. "Take her away." That quiet command, issued by the very person she had tried to destroy, ended the performance for good. Captain Bauer gave a firm nod to the two officers posted by the archway. They crossed the room, without hesitation, boots heavy against the Persian rug. One took her right arm and hauled her up off her knees. The other caught her left wrist and pulled it firmly behind her back. The sharp, clean snap of steel handcuffs locking around her pale wrists rang through the living room like a bell, the unmistakable sound of an era ending. "You have the right to remain entirely silent." The taller officer's voice was flat and unhurried, rolling right over her sudden, frantic wailing. "Anything you say can and absolutely will be used against you in a court of law." As those words were recited, every last shred of her cultivated elegance and practiced superiority cracked apart beyond any repair. She erupted, thrashing against the officer's grip, her designer dress twisting and tearing as she kicked at nothing. What came out of her mouth wasn't language anymore, just raw guttural fury and screaming denial. She cursed my name. She cursed Dr. Calloway for folding so completely, and she flung vile, vicious words at the boy she'd been calling her sweet baby only moments before. She fought with the frenzied, chaotic desperation of a cornered animal that finally understands there is no way out. The officers didn't waver for a second. They hauled her across the polished hardwood floor, pulling her forcefully out of the beautiful home she had schemed so ruthlessly to make her own. I stood beside my son and watched with cold, steady satisfaction as the struggle moved through the long foyer and out the heavy oak front door. Conrad Fielding offered a brief professional nod before turning to follow Captain Bauer into the night air, intent on seeing the booking proceed exactly as planned. The front door swung shut behind them, cutting off the noise. I crossed slowly to the large bay windows and drew the velvet curtain back an inch to look outside. The red and blue lights of the patrol cars swept across the manicured lawn and the neighboring houses in a churning, rhythmic pulse. I watched as Nadine was put into the back of a cruiser, her face pushed against the reinforced glass, still twisted with rage. Dr. Calloway was already seated in a separate vehicle, head bowed, the fight completely gone out of him. A few minutes later, the engines turned over and the convoy rolled in procession down my gravel driveway. The spinning lights shrank and disappeared into the quiet dark and then silence. The kind of silence the house hadn't known in years. This place had been a suffocating trap, a den of chemical deceit for a full decade. Now, it simply felt still, as though the toxic presence that had poisoned every room had finally been drawn out of the walls. I turned from the window and looked back into the lit living room. Colton and I were alone. The hard charge of adrenaline was slowly draining out of us both. My gaze drifted to the far corner, settling on the rusted steel wheelchair, sitting empty in the shadows, the physical monument to everything she had done to him. A vile throne of manufactured helplessness, bolted together from lies that had kept my brilliant son tethered to a story that was never true. I looked at the worn leather armrests, the dull and scuffed wheels, and something immense and righteous began rising from somewhere deep inside my chest. I didn't say a word to Colton. I turned and walked with deliberate steps down the hall, shoved open the side door into the garage, bypassed the toolboxes, and closed my hand around a heavy steel maul resting heavily on the wooden workbench. The cold weight of the metal settled into my grip. I walked back into the living room with my eyes locked on that chair. I lifted the maul above my shoulder and brought it down with everything I had onto the center of that frame. The crash rang off the walls like a gunshot in an empty cathedral. I swung again and again, caving in the wheel, spokes destroying the padded seat, hammering the whole hated thing into a twisted, jagged wreckage that bore no resemblance to what it had been. When I finally stepped back and let the maul drop onto the ruined pile, I felt something shift in my chest, a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years, releasing all at once. "It is over," I said, breathing hard into the quiet room. Colton stepped forward, and for the first time in a decade, he smiled a real one. "No, Dad, it is just beginning." He was right. Smashing that wheelchair wasn't the ending. It was the opening shot of a methodical, relentless campaign for total justice. The weeks that followed came fast. Federal indictments, courtroom hearings, vindication delivered in the hard legal language. Nadine and Dr. Calloway were stripped of their comfortable lives and dropped into the cold machinery of the criminal justice system. The mountain of evidence Conrad and I had assembled through that sleepless night proved impossible to overcome. The charges were severe conspiracy to commit attempted murder, large-scale medical fraud, grand embezzlement. I sat in the front row of that packed courtroom with a stone face and watched the arrogant doctor and my treacherous former wife answer for what they had done. Nadine tried the victim routine one final time, sobbing for the judge, but the toxicology results and the mechanic's invoice killed any sympathy before it could take root. The judge looked down from the bench with open disgust and handed down a verdict without mercy. Both Nadine and Dr. Calloway were sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole. They were let out in chains, hollowed of the dignity they had worn like armor, while Colton and I walked out of that courthouse into the open air as free men. With the people who had engineered our suffering locked away behind steel, I shifted my focus to the financial wreckage. Conrad Fielding turned out to be a genuine predator in the legal arena, exactly what we needed. Together, we went after the major international bank that had facilitated Nadine's encrypted offshore transfers year after year, without a single flag raised. We laid out their negligence in full, their systematic failure to protect my late brother's designated medical trust fund. Staring down a public catastrophe and our forensic evidence, their executives settled out of court for an enormous sum. Every stolen dollar came back. The full $8 million trust was restored. I didn't stop there. I petitioned the court to dissolve the conservatorship Nadine had wielded as a weapon for so long. The presiding judge reviewed Colton's documented recovery and his clean medical evaluations and granted the request without hesitation. The next morning, I walked into Conrad's downtown office and worked through a tall stack of legal documents, signing each one. Every recovered asset, every property deed, the entire trust fund transferred permanently into Colton's name. The money was finally where my generous brother Edmund had always meant it to be, safe, untouchable his. Securing that was a victory, but the harder fight had nothing to do with courtrooms or bank settlements. Colton had spent 10 years locked in chemical paralysis, and his body faced a monumental task in clawing back what had been taken from it. We put him straight into an elite intensive rehabilitation program built for extreme cases. The daily sessions were brutal, designed to push him past every limit he'd thought he had. I was there every morning, in that bright echoing gym, watching him drive his rebuilding muscles past the point of ordinary endurance. There were days of real blinding pain moments when his legs simply gave out beneath him, and he went down onto the blue mats drenched in sweat and fighting back tears. He'd gasp for breath, hands white-knuckled around the rails of the parallel bars, lungs burning. And every single time, I was right there. I spotted his lifts. I held his shoulders steady through the balance work. When the exhaustion threatened to swallow his spirit entirely, I was the voice that pushed back. "You are doing perfectly, son," I'd tell him, pressing a cool towel to his forehead. "You are building armor they can never ever pierce again." Week by week, the change in him accelerated beyond anything I had dared to imagine. The wasted muscles that had been deliberately starved of use began filling out with real hard-won strength. Those first trembling, uncertain steps grew into a stride that was assured and unhurried. The ghost of his stolen youth faded and disappeared, replaced by the solid, capable frame of a young man who had walked through the worst kind of darkness and come out the other side whole. The bond between us, corroded for years by Nadine's poison, was reforged through every grueling session. Every morning, we showed up together until it was harder than anything she had ever managed to build. He drove himself past every wall his body threw up, clawing back every day that had been stripped from him. The long gray months of winter slowly gave way to a bright spring, and the oppressive dread that had lived inside our home for so long gave way at last to something that felt like genuine warmth and real hope. In the evenings, we'd sit on the back porch as the sun went down over the property, and Colton would talk about the plans he'd carried quietly inside him all those years, his voice holding the weight of a survivor and the heat of a man who has finally been handed his life back. He had spent 10 years inside a silent cage watching the world move on without him, and he flatly refused to let the mass of that lost time drag him under. He turned all that compressed, burning energy into fuel, pouring over heavy textbooks and architectural blueprints late into the night, rebuilding the razor-sharp structural mind that had been his before the crash took everything. I watched him work with a swell of paternal pride that I couldn't have put into words. The calculated chemical suppression Nadine had used against his mind had failed to snuff out what was at his core. He wasn't merely healing from the damage. He was thriving, deliberately mapping out a life that was finally entirely his own to build. The deep scars were still there, etched permanently into our shared history, but they no longer set the terms of each day. We had faced the people who tried to bury us and walked away standing. We came out of it sharper, closer, and unbroken. Exactly 6 months after that night, I eased behind the wheel of my beautifully restored classic vintage Ford truck on a crisp, bright morning, the engine's low rumble settling into my chest like something familiar and good. Sunlight caught the polished chrome as I moved through the busy streets with a calm I hadn't felt in years. I turned onto a wide avenue and pulled up in front of a prestigious architectural firm in downtown Philadelphia. The new chapter had officially begun, and I felt nothing but impatience to see what my son would do with it. I pulled the gear selector into park and cut the engine. The crushing weight that had ground me down for a decade was gone, completely and simply gone. I felt relaxed. I felt genuinely happy. I felt like myself for the first time in what seemed like another lifetime. I unclipped my seatbelt, pushed open my door, and stepped out onto the Philadelphia pavement. The morning air moved past us as I came around the front of the truck and swung open the passenger door for Colton. He stepped out into the sunlight. He moved with a measured, deliberate grace that asked for nothing but commanded everything. There was a slight permanent limp in his right leg, the body's honest record of what had been done to him, but it did not slow him or shrink him in the slightest. He gripped a sleek, polished carbon fiber walking cane. His hand settled firm and easy around the smooth, brushed steel handle. For all the unevenness in his gait, he stood tall, projecting a quiet, iron-spined strength. He stopped on the sidewalk and took a moment to straighten the dark silk tie against his crisp white collar. Then he tilted his head back and looked up at the soaring glass and steel tower above us. This firm had come after him, recruited him on the basis of his portfolio, and nothing else. Today was his first day as a junior architect. He was taking back with both hands the future that had been savagely ripped from him at 18 years old. I stood beside him in silence, watching the reflections of passing cars ripple across the building's mirrored face, and felt a surge of pride so large it had nowhere to go. He had endured years of chemical imprisonment in the dark, and he had come through it focused, capable, and ready. The road to this sidewalk had dragged us through every kind of exhaustion: courtrooms, rehabilitation sessions, sleepless nights buried in documents. But watching him stand here under his own power, his own ambition burning without restraint, every bit of it had been worth the cost. The woman who had poisoned him and stolen his youth was behind federal prison walls serving out her sentence with no path to early release. Her greedy accomplice was in the same position, his fraudulent medical license gone, his illicit wealth seized, his comfortable life reduced to nothing. We had taken apart their operation piece by piece, recovered every stolen dollar of the trust fund, and returned every asset to the person it had always belonged to. Colton was no longer the prisoner of that rusted wheelchair. He was a free man walking into his own future under his own terms. We didn't need speeches or tears there on that busy sidewalk. We simply turned and held each other in a brief, firm embrace. It was the kind of hug that carries more than words can, a quiet acknowledgement between two men who had gone through the ugliest corners of human cruelty together and made it out the other side. He pulled back and gave me a small, steady smile, full of something that looked like hope and gratitude in equal measure. I put my hand firmly on his shoulder one last time. He turned away, gripped his cane, and walked with unhurried, unshakable purpose, straight toward the revolving glass doors of the lobby. I stayed where I was, leaning against the cool metal fender of the truck, and watched his tall figure move through the glass and disappear into the crowd. I closed my eyes for a moment and drew in a long, slow breath of the cool Philadelphia air. The darkness that had defined so many of our years was behind us for good, traded for a horizon that was wide open and entirely ours. The justice we had fought so hard and so long to reach had finally been delivered, and everything that mattered, our family's name, our future, my brother, Edmund's legacy, now rested in the steady, capable hands of my son. I opened my eyes feeling genuinely ready for whatever quiet and peaceful days came next, certain in a way I had never quite been before that the nightmare was finally completely done. The most dangerous enemies are rarely the strangers hiding in dark alleys. Sometimes they are the people sleeping right beside us, wrapped in the appearance of love and care. True evil turns our deepest trust against us, making our own sacrifices into the weapons it uses to wound us. But no lie, no matter how carefully it is built or how long it is kept alive, can hold forever against the steady pressure of the truth. When something feels wrong with the people closest to you, trust that feeling and don't let it go. Honest instinct is a powerful shield, and taking decisive action is the only real way to protect the people you love. In every move I make each time I choose to rise when falling would be simpler, I carry your courage inside my chest, your fire burning deep within my soul. And even as the years keep rolling forward, your love is still the thing that brings me back. One day the snow will bury every footprint. One day the last ember will fade to nothing. But what a father passes to his daughter, that doesn't go. Not the wealth, not the stories told around the table, not the battles he once won, but the quiet, steady way he loved her and the woman that love shaped her into. I am my father's daughter, and that will never change through every victory, every defeat, through every joy and every ache. The world will keep on shifting around me. The stars themselves may dim overhead, but I will carry my father's boundless love with me wherever I go. And when someone stops to ask me who I am, I'll smile and say it simply, and without hesitation, I am my father's daughter. I am my father's daughter. That is where this story ends, not in bitterness, but in something that looks a great deal like grace. Colton walked through those revolving glass doors on his own 2 feet, and I watched him go with more peace in my chest than I had felt in a decade. I won't pretend the journey was anything other than brutal. It cost me years of sleep, years of doubt, and a grief that doesn't have a clean name, the grief of loving someone who was using that love as a weapon against you. But I believe God does not let the truth stay buried forever. The light finds its way through even when the darkness has been carefully constructed and maintained for years. What that season taught me is something I want to leave with you today, especially if you are part of that generation, the adults 50 plus, among us who have watched a family member manipulated, isolated, or silenced by someone they trusted. First, pay attention to the quiet changes. When someone you love stops speaking freely, stops moving through the world the way they used to, that is not always age. Sometimes it is a hand that has been placed over their voice. Second, document everything before you move. Evidence speaks in a courtroom when emotion cannot. Gather it carefully and guard it well. Third, do not face it alone. The right people. A lawyer you trust, a doctor who is truly on your side, can change everything. Fourth, no scheme built on greed survives the full light of truth. This family, revenge story, as painful as it was to live, proved that. If this story reached something in you, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and they matter to me. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take good care of yourselves and the people you love. Until next time.